All right, welcome back. Today we're going to go over another psychiatry-based book. This is the Perspectives of Psychiatry. It goes over 4 different perspectives that you can use when approaching and initially interviewing a patient, even as you develop and work through their treatment plan while they're either inpatient or outpatient. So it's a book that gives you another way to look at your job as a psychiatrist or as a mental health care professional. So we're going to jump into this book. I want to go through the 4 different perspectives, give a little bit of a case example, and just have a general discussion of the book, give you enough information that you could take from this video alone. But of course, I encourage you to get the book and read it if you want a more in-depth understanding. So a little bit of an overview about the book to begin. Perspectives of Psychiatry was first published in 1983. And while its contents are still relevant today, you can tell just by some of the terminology that it's a bit dated in that aspect, but the principles remain the same. And it was written by Drs. Paul McHugh and Phillip Slavney, both of whom were faculty at Johns Hopkins. And it was actually a faculty member at my institution that recommended this book to me. He trained at Johns Hopkins, and I reached out to a friend of mine who is currently training at Johns Hopkins to ask if this book was still relevant, I guess you could say, to their training. And I was told that it is not only relevant, but it is still foundational to their training and their way of interviewing patients and conceptualizing treatment plans. So gives you a little bit of an understanding of how this came from Johns Hopkins and is still largely employed there. This book is aiming to tackle, in one way, the fact that psychiatry for a long time now, and still to varying degrees, has been very fractionated in terms of different psychiatrists following different models of how to approach their practice. And it has led to this denominational approach where you have different professionals disagreeing with each other based on principles, essentially of whether or not they're following the right framework. And so this book is trying to put forth these 4 perspectives that anyone and everyone can use to try to bridge these gaps and bring everyone together on the same page. Very ambitious goal. We'll see how it does in terms of reaching that goal. But regardless, I believe that the 4 perspectives presented here are very useful for anyone and everyone to employ. And whether or not it dispenses with the fractionated denominational approach that many different psychiatrists have across the country and around the world even, I think that it's still valuable for everyone to have this in their toolkit. So what are the 4 distinct perspectives proposed by this book? The disease perspective, the dimensional perspective, the behavioral perspective, and the life story perspective. And again, we're going to tackle each of these in sequence so that we have a better understanding of what this really means by the end of the video. So let's go ahead and get started, and we'll start with the disease perspective, the perspective that you're most familiar with at this point. And this is because this is how we are trained in the medical model in medical school. We're trained primarily on the disease perspective. Now, most often in psychiatry, this has to do with the brain, the organ itself. And in this model, symptoms are treated as a disorder that the clinician needs to diagnose and then treat specifically. Now, within psychiatry, we ask ourselves what types of disorders that we do diagnose align most aptly with this disease perspective. And that would be things that we understand more of a clear etiology for in terms of where these diseases, if we want to call them that, are deriving from. So we think of things most typically like dementias, and we think of things like schizophrenia, albeit we may not have thought of schizophrenia that long ago, but now that we understand more of the mechanisms behind the disease, at least we believe we understand to a degree these dopaminergic theories as to why patients are experiencing the symptoms or the downstream effects of schizophrenia. So it seems that the more we understand in terms of the etiology of a disease, the more the disease perspective aligns with how we conceptualize that. But otherwise, the less we understand, the more difficult it is to fit different, let me stop using the word diseases, let me say disorders or syndromes within that perspective. So it kind of depends on what we're dealing with as to whether or not, or how much we want to employ rather, this disease perspective. But let me go further on an explanation of where it's useful and why. Disorders or diseases where we understand the natural etiology, it helps us in order to classify it and to target specific treatments at that etiology to try to cure the disease itself. This is where it's most useful. This perspective, the authors argue, is more explanatory than it is descriptive. And in saying that, what we're really saying is that it explains more so why they are experiencing their disease or disorder, but not what they personally are experiencing. Take a delusion within a schizophrenic framework. For example, it says why they may be experiencing that delusion, but it doesn't really get into the weeds of what that delusion means for them or where it may be coming from in terms of their past traumas or in terms of their fears or their personal agency as such. But it has its limits, of course, because as we know as psychiatrists, all of these disorders that we deal with do not derive, as far as we're aware, directly from biologic consequence. They may be coming from other aspects of a person's life story overall. It may be coming from aspects of their personality and how their personality is engaging with their surroundings, with their environment. So this points us towards more of the limits that the disease perspective has. And this is something that I think becomes more and more painfully obvious to students as they are learning about these disorders that we find within the DSM. We start to see as we go down the list, okay, these fit a disease model less and less appropriately the more nuanced the disorders become. And it becomes difficult to use the medical model that is so focused on a disease perspective that we learn in medical school to approach some of these other disorders that we'll talk about more later in the video. And why might it be a problem? Because some of these other disorders that we'll talk about maybe anxiety or certain forms of depression. If we use a disease perspective and we take it as granted that we understand directly where it's coming from and we try to treat only that etiology, we may be missing the mark, so to speak, in terms of where it's really deriving from within the individual person. And if we miss that, then we could prolong suffering or even fail to address the root cause of particular issues altogether. But within its proper bounds, the disease perspective is of course indispensable because it brings in the precision of the medical decision making along with the biologic intervention that allows us or affords us the opportunity to actually treat the root cause of some of these diseases. And without this approach, modern psychiatry, which has made great leaps and bounds in recent history, would be unrecognizable. Now, next, let's move on to one that's perhaps a bit less familiar. This is going to be the dimension perspective. Now, whereas the disease perspective was focused on categorical pathologies, the dimension perspective places each individual on a dimension with different axes. So we can think of things like personality. It lends very well to this perspective. And you may or may not be familiar with, you probably are, but just in case, with the big 5 personality traits. So the acronym is OCEAN. We think of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And it posits that every individual person will fall somewhere on the dimension of each of those personality traits. And if we know where they fall on each of those personality traits, then we have a better understanding of the accumulation of their personality overall. And then we ask ourselves, okay, how does a person's individual personality interact with their environment? Where may they have weak points within their ability to tolerate stress? In other words, what sorts of things may stress them out more or less? Where may they be strong in terms of their ability to navigate particular situations? If we understand that as a psychiatrist trying to help an actual individual with all of their different aspects of personality, then we can better understand where some of the problems may be coming from. We can better understand where they may need help strengthening aspects of their personality, where they may need to build up further resilience. And in doing so, we can help them outside of the medical model in terms of pharmacology altogether. We can help them just to become a more resilient individual and to better align their adaptations, so to speak, with their actual personal environments, whether that be where they live, whether that be within the confines of their family and friends, or whether that be their career. All of these aspects of their life can be aided by strengthening different aspects of their dimensions in terms of their personality or otherwise. So in contrast, the dimension perspective asks more so, what kind of person is this? And less so, what does this person have? Now, there's actually a risk to this perspective, and it's one that I do enjoy bringing up and talking about. And the risk is that traits, in terms of where people fall on particular dimensions, can feel as though they're immutable, as though they cannot be changed over time. And you will even hear at times some clinicians say this. They'll say that personality traits can't be changed, that they're fixed. And there's some truth to this, but I also disagree to a degree. And that is because while it is true that personality traits within this dimension model are relatively fixed, it is not true that they are absolutely fixed, that they cannot be changed by any means. They can be changed to a degree, and it may take a certain amount of time. It may take longer than someone may prefer, but you can work through this with therapy and with personal agency. And I think it's important that your patients understand that these aspects of their personality aren't absolutely fixed, that it's a tendency, and it may be a very strong tendency, so much so that if they're not consciously aware of it and consciously thinking about it, that they may fall back into it even as time progresses, even if they've been working on it for a long time. But it doesn't mean that there's absolutely nothing they can do about it. I really dislike this idea of clinicians telling patients that this is something that they have and it's something that they can't do anything about. I think it takes away their personal agency. I think it does more harm than good. But with that said, I think it's also fair to point out to them that this is an aspect of your personality that is going to be difficult to change, and it's going to take a lot of time and focus if you want to change it to any degree. I think it's important to be realistic with patients at the same time and not just tell them, oh, because I've presented you with this information, oh, the problem is you're too neurotic, just be less neurotic, that all of a sudden it's going to magically fix the situation. We all know that's not the case either. So a good balance here is appropriate. Now, next, let's talk about the third perspective, being the behavior perspective. Now, this perspective departs quite distinctly from the disease perspective and the dimensions perspective in terms of those being very internal processes. And this is more about the external behaviors or actions of the individual. This is rooted particularly within behavioral psychology. You can think of things like classical conditioning or operant conditioning. Classical conditioning, of course, being championed by Ivan Pavlov, and operant conditioning being championed by some of your favorite B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist. So you remember that the Skinner box, you remember this from early psychology courses if you've had them, you remember these things, and it comes into play here, asking, okay, how has the patient learned these behaviors and how have they been reinforced, whether that be through classical conditioning or operant conditioning over time, over the course of their life. We're all learning all the time, and we're all being reinforced in various ways by our environment. And whether or not we're consciously aware of it, this is happening. So we try to take a step back, take a really good interview, understand the patient, understand their life history, and understand where they've been reinforced to employ certain behaviors over time, and asking them, what are you getting from these behaviors? People are often suffering from their solutions. What does that mean? This means that people may be doing things that seem very clearly maladaptive to us now, but at some point in time, it was likely offering some sort of solution to them from another problem, or in terms of another problem. So understanding this is very helpful, so we can see, okay, where did the patient learn to behave this way? And then understanding that, we can say, okay, how are we going to undo this learned behavior? Where does this fit in? It fits in nicely with addictions. It fits in with, say, like alcohol use disorder or opioid use disorder. It also fits in well with eating disorders, which in some ways, neurobiologically speaking, are a sort of addiction in terms of how they operate. So the point of this, as opposed to the life story perspective, which we'll talk about next, is not so much to very distinctly explain where these behaviors are coming from, but rather to understand the pattern that's playing out and how we can disrupt this pattern and replace it with something healthier. Take this maladaptive pattern and replace it with a more adaptive one. And in doing so, we interrupt this cycle that the patient may be caught in. And again, hearkening back to what I was saying when we were talking about the dimensions perspective, one thing that this does a good job of is giving agency back to the patient, back to the person you're trying to help, giving them the control to say, this is what you're doing. Now that you understand it better, you can insert yourself into this cycle and you can make a change. You can deviate from this path, and we can deviate further over time and get more on a healthy road. So it takes away this idea of what the patient has. You have this, and it puts more focus on what you're doing, because it's more easy for people to conceptualize how they can change what they're doing as compared to how could someone change what they have, or especially if they feel as though this is who they are. It's much more easy to say, no, let's not focus on who you are or what you have. Let's focus more on what you're doing. And we can very clearly understand how we can simply change what you're doing. It may not be so simple at all times, but it's more simple to conceptualize that, if that makes sense. Now, finally, we reach the fourth perspective, that being the life story perspective. And you know I enjoy this one, as I'm really interested in depth psychology and psychodynamic therapy. So this is the final lens, and it differs from the others in some pretty significant ways. In many ways, it's the most humanistic perspective of the four, and it simply recognizes that a lot of human suffering isn't simply reducible to disease or trait or behavioral patterns. Sometimes problems derive from what a person has experienced or the overall lens of their life. And it takes the patient within this perspective from being a passive bystander of what's happening to them, and again, gives them agency to be the author of the meaning of their life. So this is a very collaborative process, exploring this particular perspective with the patient. It's very collaborative. It really invites the big question of what has happened to you over the course of your life, and how have you personally made sense of it? Now, this is an important distinction when it comes to the life story perspective. So anyone watching this, I really want you to focus in on this distinction. The goal with something like this is not to objectively describe in a purely fact-based manner what has happened to the person at different points in their life, but it's to understand the narrative of their life as they understand it. Now, it's important to try to get your facts straight so that you as the clinician understand what may have led to these things, right? But the point isn't to just simply hand them a book with the written description of what has happened to them, because it's not so much objectively what has happened to them, it's how they understand it and how they fit it into the narrative of their life overall. That's where the meaning is to be found. Now, why do we do this? Well, we do this to offer back to the patient a narrative of their life that offers them some sense of agency, an opportunity that gives them a chance at coherence, adaptation, and redemption overall. The serious problems in life, however, are never fully solved. If ever they should appear to be so, it is a sure sign that something has been lost. The meaning and purpose of a problem seem to lie not in its solution, but in our working at it incessantly. So this is again to say that the goal is not just to describe what has happened, but the goal is to understand where it fits into a person's narrative and how they can continue living out their narrative by working on building up these aspects of the self and improving these aspects and leaving the traumas of the past behind after extracting the meaning from those experiences so that that meaning can be used going forward. The brain really wants to avoid re-experiencing traumatic events. So when something happens to someone, it's not necessarily enough to just forget about it. The brain wants to take the latent meaning within that experience and hold on to it moving forward in terms of how to avoid such an experience in the future. So this is another example of the life story perspective at work. So for the patient that comes in and says they don't know who they are anymore, this perspective is ready to be employed, and it is ready to explain to them, well, let's look at who you have been and who you are becoming. And let's focus on that who you are becoming part, and let's aim that person in the right direction. Now let's put all of these perspectives together: the disease perspective, the dimensions perspective, behavioral perspective, life story perspective, and let's look at made up case example based on real patients, but of course obscuring any particular details. So imagine you have a patient that comes in, we'll say young adult, we'll say 30s male, and they have a history, as they explain to you, of what they would call clinical depression, but it's been going on for 15 years straight. Now, just as an example, depression typically lasts 6 to 9 months untreated, right? An episode of major depression. So already we're thinking, okay, something seems a little outside of the norm in terms of how we understand the distinct disorder of major depression. And so we can employ these different perspectives. We can say, okay, well, from a disease perspective, the person may be experiencing some of the downstream effects of low serotonin overall. From a dimensions perspective, this patient may be slightly introverted, so low in extroversion, and they may be high in neuroticism. Okay, that gives us some understanding of who the person is and how they may interact with their environment. From a behavioral perspective, we may come to understand that they've learned to isolate and to shut down in order to avoid fear of being outcast or of being denied socially. And then as far as life story perspective, we may understand that certain things happened to them early in their life that affected the way that they viewed their self overall. And it may be affecting how they feel they can move forward, or maybe affecting how they feel that they cannot move forward. And we may need to adjust their perspective of who they are as a person and fit in these past experiences into a narrative of their life that allows them a path forward. So if we employ all of those together, then we have a much more well-rounded and holistic approach, which is my goal now and in the future, in terms of how to help a patient become who they want to be, reach their goals, and live a fulfilling life. So in this way, we see how the four perspectives are often working in parallel. Will an understanding of this book get rid of the denominational approach of psychiatrists around the world? I do not know, but will an understanding of these four perspectives help us to approach patients in a holistic way? I do feel confident in that. So if you have enjoyed this video, like it helps the channel. It helps me understand what people want to see from me going forward. And I hope that you employ these perspectives as you move forward as well. I enjoy, as always, having the opportunity to read these books and share my thoughts with you directly through this channel. And I appreciate your time watching these videos. So with that said, I will see you in the next one.